Welcome to the final round of the 2002 CEDA National Tournament. Before I introduce the teams, I'd like to introduce the folks who will be judging the debate. They are, if you will raise your hands, Justin Scar from Cal State Fullerton. Matt Moore from Augustana College. Jared Ellis from Lewis and Clark. Sarah Partlow from Idaho State. Sean Tippy from Southwest Texas State University. Jackie Massey from Vermont. Shanara Reed from Alabama University. Melissa Wade from Emory. John Sharp is not judging, he's just squatting up at the table. Don't encourage him. And then the final judge is Josh Martin from Chico State. Sure. Our participants in this debate on the affirmative is Fort Hays State University, Joe Ramsey and Jason Renier. And on the negative, from Michigan State, Austin Carson and Callum Matheson. Our timekeeper for this event will be Amy Dempster. Don't forget the time cross-X. All right, so without further ado, Fort Hays State University.
For the history of Western thinking in the past 8 centuries has been one of replacement of ideas within a framework that has remained basically unchanged for nearly 2 millennia. Challenging this framework of interpretation means a rearrangement of our manner of perceiving the world, and it involves a re-examination of the body of human knowledge and its structural reconstruction into a new format. Such a task appears to be far from the struggles of the present. It seems abstract and meaningless in the face of contemporary suffering, and it suggests that people can be made to change their oppressive activity by intellectual reorientation alone. All of these questions arise, however, because of the fundamental orientation of Western peoples toward the world. We assume that we know the structure of reality and must make only certain minor adjustments in the machinery that operates in order to bring our institutions into line. Immediate suffering is thus placed in juxtaposition with abstract metaphysical conceptions of the world, and because we can see immediate suffering, we feel impelled to change conditions quickly, to relieve tensions, never coming to understand how these basic attitudes toward the life and its derivative attitude toward minority groups continues to dominate the goals and activities that appear to be designed to create reforms. Vine Deloria's observations regarding reform and rethinking impelled us toward a different affirmative approach. Rather than tinkering with the current system in the hopes of concocting some chimerical plan that conforms with the dominant debate worldview, we have followed such thinking and riding down the different path in the hopes of being in the debate world differently. Our various affirmative approaches over the season have been met with an outpouring of indignation and anger from many of the traditional policymaking representatives. We understand their consternation, but insist that this topic demands a refusal of business as usual. Such a refusal must resist simplistic stereotypes and essentialisms while still maintaining the critical potential of re-examining recurrent patterns. Importantly, please note that we believe the debate matters. It matters to those who participated, and it matters to those who only come into contact with tangentially. Debate does not determine who we are. None of us can ever begin to explain how that happens. But debate does implicate who we might become. For example, debate can contribute to habituated ways of being in the world that help to constitute that, our understanding of that world, of that being. Debate also matters in terms about those whom we debate. No, this is not to say that what we do in debate necessarily will translate into what we do to those implicated outside the debate bound. Instead, what we do debate is what we do to those implicated by our debating. How many of us would say that telling an offensive joke does no harm to the impugn party so long as they are not present? How many of us would say that casting ethical aspersions to the absent author matters not because, after all, the author is absent? Debate must continue to examine how debate practices matter. Vine Deloria points us in the provocative direction. Example after example could be cited, each testifying to the devastating effect of a general attitude toward the world that underlies Western approaches to human knowledge. The base of this attitude is the assumption that the world operates in certain predetermined ways, that it operates continually under certain natural laws, and that the nature of every species is homogeneous with a few real deviants. One can trace this attitude back into the Western past. Religious concepts which have since been transformed into scientific and political beliefs remain objects of belief as securely as if they had never been severed from their theological moorings. Debate need no look further than itself to recognize how securely certain beliefs about the world are held, and to notice how these assumptions sometimes predetermine the way debates transpire. Wait a minute, one might object, debate has changed, you are now the hegemony, but this naive response fails to grapple with one of the most fundamental attitudes that underlies debate's approach to human knowledge, the one seemingly immovable object in the current relentless interrogation of debate by debate is its view of affirmation. Certainly critiques, performance, activism, genealogy, and the like have given the appearance of change, even radical change, but still, debaters continue to argue in ways that reveal ingrained, frequently unshakable beliefs about affirmation. No matter how much debate pays lip service to question its fundamental assumptions, it constantly returns to a framework of interpretation that presupposes the legitimacy and necessity of a formalized treatment of the resolution, replacing one topic for the next without ever noticing the sometimes incommensurable worlds. For example, topics are regularly interpreted as calls for action, if only in a particular debate room, if only for a specific debate round. Debaters are expected to affirm the topic by acknowledging its explicit language, and this year's obvious call for the United States federal government to substantially increase federal control throughout Indian country. Obvious, that is, despite the seemingly polyvalence of, for instance, federal control that suggests government restraint and increased government management. An Indian country that traverses the globe, one or more of the following topic areas that traverse themselves. Given debate's recent, expansive, and inclusive notion of debate practice, affirmers are allowed to affirm the topic in many different ways, to demand on the state, to perform resistance, to endorse activism, activate the judge space, to advocate a plan without fiat, to overlay maps, expose capitalism, read narratives, to stand in solidarity against imperialism and for indigenous cultures, but above all, to affirm, to respond to a topical gale that obviously requires action, if only on the part of the debaters. This philosophical mandate, which intertwines any topical affirmation with a predetermined belief in human agency, testifies to the mere repetitiveness of a recent debate trend rather than any radical departure from the norm established over at least the last 5 decades. Debate theory has failed to keep pace with the rapid expansion of its knowledge base. This year's topic is the perfect opportunity for debate to interrogate its own jingoism. More importantly, however, this year's topic requires a confrontation with that provinciality. Failure to do so once again forces a devastating knowledge regime on those about whom we debate. Acquiesces to a nostalgia that harkens back to the days when debate unwittingly committed argumentative and discursive atrocities against others, consents to a violent chauvinism in the name of some bygone glory. When debate accepts the upper tale of its forebears to participate in debate as if nothing had changed, debate becomes apology for further colonizations of those it purports to represent. Debate tells another offensive joke. What then should we do, the debate traditionalists ask, confirming yet again those inculcated beliefs about the world that predetermine and frame what counts as acceptable argument and affirmation? Once again, divine DeLorean suggests another path. We see that the proper question we should have asked with respect to housing did not concern housing at all, but covered the more general question of the nature of a community. We discovered that the college application, the bilingual program, should have been transcended by questions concerning the nature of knowledge, how it is transmitted, and how it can be expanded, rather than how specific predetermined course of action can be implemented. Once we reject the absolute nature of Western conceptions of problems, we are able to see different types of questions inherent in our immediate problem areas. The immediacy we feel when observing conditions under which people live should enable us to raise new issues that contain within themselves new ways of conceiving solutions. Accepting debate's hail and affirming the topic as a problem to be solved asks the wrong question and invites the same answers. Merely accommodating this topic, like all topics, the debate's fundamental framework operates within an ethnocidal logic that silences perspective hostile to debate's traditional mission of making sure the trains run on time. Extraordinary differences exist between debate's resolute beliefs about the world and the richly diverse knowledge bases about those we debate. Uniform continuous time, inductive and deductive reasoning, planetary production of knowledge, ontology, the subject-object dichotomy, and a litany of other beliefs dramatically differentiate the people of Turtle Island as well as the rest of the world. Confronting this year's topic involves more than seeking after the missing element in today's society critical for indigenous survival. Affirming this topic must establish a different relationship with those about whom we debate. DeLorean recognizes the visionary possibilities violently excluded by dominant ways of being in the world. Until fundamental questions regarding the assumptions that form the basis for Western civilization are raised and new articulations for reality are discovered, the impulse to grab quickly and apparently easy answers will continue. Social conditions will continue to be described in a cause and effect logic that has dominated Western thinking for its entire intellectual lifetime. Programs will be designed that fail to account for the change in conditions that occur continuously in human society. Ideas continue to dominate our concerns, and visions will not come. How are these questions to be raised? Articulations discovered? Debate cannot rethink all of Western civilization, a skeptic cries. No, we cannot rethink all of Western thinking during debate round, nor can we suspend all judgment until such rethinking occurs. Instead, debate's current speed of reflexivity must include an examination of the everyday. It must attend to the way it worlds and the worlds of others emerge. Concentrate specifically on how this year's topic transverses time and space, to solve the subject-object, and renders suspect standard forms of proof and evidence. How the apparent transformation happening in debate frequently fails to rearrange its manner of perceiving the world. This reflexivity must re-examine the body of human knowledge as it relates to hegemonic Western epistemic practice brought to bear continuously whenever and wherever debate confronts this and any other topic. Debate about so-called federal control throughout Indian country exceeds this time, this space, Columbus, Sheridan, Bentray, Wake Forest, airport lounges, and the bison. Ah, the bison. Any germane topical affirmation must rebuke debate's narrow disciplinary, must engage the topic's diverse beliefs, re-examine and rearrange fundamental conceptions such as agency, dissent, language, reality, policy, argument, and the like. Affirm this topic in its everydayness, as transversal dissent, temporally and spatially. Affirm this topic as a vision. Repudiate the easy solutions so often offered by debate. Resist violent, nostalgic impulses, and embrace the possibility of another world vision every day.
All right. Your Deloria evidence talks about creating a new way of having a relationship with those who we've discussed in the debate community. What kind of new relation do you propose?
What we're speaking of is that so often when we create affirmatives, when we start the year, we start the topic, we have this literature base that is the appropriate literature base, and we delve into that literature base, find the appropriate harms, areas, and then we try to solve immediate suffering. What Deloria is talking about is to let those knowledge bases about people whom we debate about and that influence us to bleed in to our views of debate. And one way we think that is productive is his idea of visions. And he says that the problem so often is that we try to create fantastic plans, that we try to end immediate suffering quickly, and a vision is a way to...
That's not exactly my question. My question is not just what do you think this does. My question is, how does the last few words in your first speech, which include this argument that you affirm a vision of the topic, what vision do you propose? You've obviously thought about these things. I'm sure when you wrote this, you had a lot of understanding of this. What do you think from what you know?
This is important. The vision is not something that can be described. That's sort of the point. Is a vision is, we believe at least in part, stands in juxtaposition to ideas. That we should stop treating the world like it is, like there's these natural laws that we can divide and conquer the world and know the world, and instead we should let the world come to us.
Topic, right?
We affirm the topic as a vision, not a vision of the topic. As a vision, it's a way of thinking. It's a way of perceiving.
Federal control is the vision that you affirm.
No.
What is the
We affirm the topic as a vision, not one word of the topic or whatever.
That the United States
entire
federal
topic
government
as a vision.
Federal control over Indian country. That's what you affirm as a vision. What's good about that vision? What's to affirm?
Don't think about it like we've got a plan that's a vision. It is a way of reconceptualizing the world. We think that way of reconceptualizing the world is specifically important in relationship to the topic, to the language in the topic, and that we should affirm that vision in relation to the topic.
Understood. You also say that we should try and understand the way that other people create their worlds, that the people that we discuss in the topic create their worlds. How do you go about this?
We believe that partially happened in the 1AC when we talk about Deloria's notion of vision.
Okay, which is the discussion of how some Native Americans view the world, their own worlds.
Some.
You also argue,
not only Native
of course
Americans.
Not. Some people, but including Native Americans, which is why we're talking about it in this topic, arguably, rather than other topics. You also say that that an imperial system exists stretching back 2,000 years. I take it you consider yourselves...
An imperial way of thinking.
I take it you consider yourselves at least somewhat participants, or at least subjects of the colonial system. So are Austin and I. So are largely all the people in the room, I imagine. Thank you.
Peace, Power, and Righteousness. Dylan S. Meyer was the director of the War Relocation Authority operating in the sunny state of California. Meyer's job was to confine Japanese Americans in concentration camps. Dylan Meyer just wanted to help. His experience qualified him, fortunately, to direct the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where he continued his work. Meyer represented a vision of control, one which continues to this day. His liberal vision of reform is an example of what the act critiques, but this vision will not simply stop. It is fully confident in itself and self-replicating. Drennan notes in 1987, the men who ran America's concentration camps were liberals, all shared the earlier generation of reformers of the zeal to cleanse, purify, and perfect industrial America by imposing an orderly existence on immigrants, criminals, lunatics, and idiots, and prostitutes, on Native Americans, on everybody. Myers was a white king expression of this blind faith. The friendly company maintained a great psychic distance from sickness, especially when they were of a different complexion. The Myers policy has been enunciated decades earlier. The common property and civilization cannot coexist. Ultimately, this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant accent went back at least as far as the Puritan drive to banish history from the world, stripped it to its human idiosyncrasies, and subjected to regimented reason. It had existed a very long time before Myers turned them down to the instant moment as the new crop of terminations makes all too clear. And throughout, it has represented the root of America's absolutism, the sober faith that its norms are self-evident. Finally, Myers settled into his proper historical context. His long career raises issues as close to the pronouncements of a member of Ronald Reagan's cabinet. His promote is the European invasion of a continent, professional remover and relocator. Meyer imposed compulsory assimilation on both Native Americans and Japanese Americans in the service of the same, yet prejudices as Taylor, as a Terminator. He was both no more and no less than a carrier of America's absolutism. It was meant to be a WASP values. Right now, out there in the BIA or some other agency, there is a Meyer-like colonizer more than willing to step in as another liberator of Indians, treat their reservation as concentration camps, cuts their ties to past and future generations. An accident in chronology has marked the underlying meaning of Meyer's termination policy. Has been under commission of the BIA before directed WRA, and the continuing stretching from the reservation of the camps could hardly been missed. Just as the termination of Native Americans, then the relocation of ghettos, so is the relocation of Japanese Americans across the country meant the termination of their communities. The WRA under Meyer was not a mistake, but a logical outgrowth of 3 centuries of American experience. And under the BIA, Meyer was not a mistake, but an explicit reversion of these ingrained racist themes explored and fought on behalf of the liberal Native Americans. The affirmative presents a vision of federal control. No matter what you think of their argument, it is still a vision, a description of Native Americans in the federal government, even if it is a highly atypical one. But we believe that the vision of control are not to be affirmed. Control is bad. Even if federal control collapses, areas subvert themselves, or transversal dissent exerts continuities in the debate, the system is not stable. This topic is still fundamentally incorrect. And what I see is, in its own way, seeks a solution. We argue that this is not only contradictory, but in this case, self-defeating. We are all debaters, and if they are correct, we are participating in a corrupt system. We have not altered the system over the years. We have made it more coherent. Everyone has debated for Hayes. Everyone has heard of transversal dissent in Bleecker in 2000. But as their message spreads, it warps itself. Their messages are unclear. Do they affirm control? Condemn it. Are they debating or anti-debating? Imperialism is too broad, too old, too experienced to simply to roll over and die. Even they admit that it cannot all be reformed. Any participation in this concert will corrupt us. Alpha Nuts in 1999. The brutal regime of European technological advancement and domination confronted the opposite of indigenous societies, resulting in their extinction of indigenous people, created a vacuum which European regime established to political, economic, philosophical dominance. At their core, European citizens and their offspring still provided the same disrespectful impulses they did 500 years ago. Questions of justice, social, political, environmental, or all best concerned outside the framework across the European thought, European traditions, indigenous traditions on their repository, vast experience, and deep insight on achieving balance and harmony. It is a question of attitude. We should never endorse a cooperation or a vision that is complicit with the genocide of the U.S. government. Now, if we continue to 1999, even if it's not possible to change the system from within, individuals' action within the system do matter. We can accept or reject, promote or hinder the state's agenda. Contentious is the opposite end of the reaction spectrum from co-option. It is not cooperative, not participatory vision. It should be a state, its actors, and its policies. It's met with the kind of marginally progressive halfway measures before the state to appease the less committed among us. Instead, it demands accountability for the underlying power relations, the state's domination of our existence, to refuse to be drawn to maintain the colonial system, and takes a firm stance in defense of the principles that conform to the core of indigenous nations. We must stop trying to understand the Native perspective, stop analyzing, stop reaching out. Face it, we are products, participants, and contributors to an imperial system much more complex and insidious than we can easily conceive of. We have debated this topic all year. We've discussed nuclear testing, which is topical, uranium mining, tax law, water rights, gambling, sovereignty, and colonialism. We are thus pieces of a colonial apparatus and pillars of knowledge. What we know in a time of ruthless resource exploitation is a potential resource. Native Americans are the targets of genocide. Instead of knowing them, we should uphold their invisibility. Spanos in 2000, having systematized the estrangement latent in the exilic conditions of the emigrant, the uncanny ability to see what the point of view of the imperialist dominant culture is otherwise invisible. The past life of immigrants, as we know, is developed because anything that is not reified ceases to exist. It is confined inside to a mere background. The emigrant becomes spectral, who haunts the being of the imperial culture that is reduced him or her to non-being. Side recognizes the disabling aspects of the faith, but does not blind him, as he does so many progressive, postmodern, post-colonial thinkers, to the virtues and possibilities of the spectrum of marginalization. They are worth exploring. There is not just the negative position of virtues, there is also the positive benefit of challenging the system, describing it in language unavailable to those that it has already subdued. That case debate. First argument, the app is a double turn on itself. Case in point, the 1AC links to its own critique of problem-solution Western thinking. It starts by foregrounding the dangers of Western thinking, and then it proceeds to consider the ways in which our current being within the debate world functions, and it does ask the question of who should be done with the ways in which it refers the topic. Don't worry, the answer is not far behind the question. The 1AC answers with a rather detailed and frankly plan-like list of specific things that we should do, a vision to affirm the topic. They say that we need to include an examination of the everyday, dissolve subject-object, render suspect, standard forms of proof of evidence, etc. Their call to affirm transversal dissent in the everydayness of the topic is a call to action. The their own arguments refute. At B's point, this is a reason to reject and turn their project. DeLorean continues in the paragraph after their own paragraph in the 1AC, which ends in new ways of conceiving solutions. DeLorean in 1999. An old Indian study captures the radical difference between Indians and Western peoples quite adequately. The white man, the Indians maintain, has ideas. Indians have visions. Ideas have a single dimension that require a chain of connected ideas to make sense. The connections are made between ideas can lead to great insights, or they can lead to the inexorable logic of catch-22, in which the logic never leads to the polar opposite of the original proposition. A vision, on the other hand, presents a whole picture of experience and has a central meaning that stands on its own feet as an independent revelation. This evidence talks about requiring a chain of connected ideas to make sense. If it doesn't remind you of the 1AC, I'm not sure what does. The next is that their form of resistance doesn't prevent entrenching domination. Transversalism is universal and doesn't solve. Bleecker in 2000, despite engendering powerful and hidden mechanisms to change, everyday forms of resistance are not unproblematic. Like more open forms of dissent, they are certainly not immune to retrenching discursive forms of domination. Here, the works of Elias is illustrated for his subversive writings with views on women, undoubtedly supported of existing patriarchal practices. And turn their 1AC acts as an anchor, crushing transversal agency. Their ending in a vision of affirming the topic is a reason to reject them. Bleecker in 2000, a discursive notion of human agency is grounded precisely in this recognition that there is no end to circles of revealing and concealing. Anything else would suggest a static view of the world, one in which human agency is an ally, one which the future can never tear down. The boundaries of the present, just as the interactions of domination and resistance has no end. Efforts at coming to terms with them will never rise to the stage of ultimate insight. The approach to understanding dissent in human agency must remain useful only as long as it resists the temptation of digging deeper by anchoring itself in a newly discovered essence, a stable foundation that can bring the illusion of order and certainty to the world. Their 1AC is runs counter to Bleeker's project. Their attempt to unify this dissent into an overarching whole destroys the Bleecker once again in 2000. The gaze between these partial insights to raise them to a higher level by squeezing each of its fragments into an overarching whole would annihilate the unique vantage point from which Henry Webster was sought to shed light on global politics. The result is preconceived and subjective mental image imposed upon a set of idiosyncratic social dynamics. One more art concealing is closing of the very frequent space I'm trying to open throughout the book. And their articulation of agency is too exclusive. One theory can explain dissent. Lawson in 2001. More grounded notions of human agency. Bleecker seems to fear represent simply another grab for power that holding further risks to human agency. Ironically, in the process of making this argument, we attempts to render dichotomous understanding of agency, which is only exercise in opposition to domination. It strikes me as over the restrictive view of human agency. The agency is also involved in the creative production of the novel concept of social order meaning. Ultimately, there's efforts to theorize human agency, to scratch from the exploration of transversal forms of dissent in concrete historical perspectives, and in the end, we're left to wonder whether one needs to be an abstract philosophical theory of agency as Bleecker applies in order to actually decide and make decisions and to act as a human agent. I prefer to think that. Next, the 1AC is incomplete. Bleecker argues that focusing on one vantage point, i.e. the vision of affirming the topic, conceals the truth of dissent can never work. Bleecker against 2000. Such an approach entails a constant moving back and forth between theory and practice, abstraction and everydayness, tracing topics versus domination of possibilities that for dissent to the rest of the vision is in them. Each of them is studied our sides are crucial. Each offers a unique vantage point, but none of them holds the key to ultimate insight. Indeed, every process for revealing is at the same time a process of concealing the way open perspective, no matter how insightful this one conceals everything that is visible from the vantage point. This frames that occurs with the risk of such processes of revealing. Finally, transversal dissent can't topple entrenched power relations. Bleecker 2000 discursively entrenched power relations constantly by toppled by demonstrations or transversal practice of dissent and transgression of political boundaries to constantly deeply entrenched forms of discursive domination, the form of resistance of too deeply embedded in existing discursive order is likely to entrench corresponding systems of exclusion. I stand up for cross-examination. Shirley, here's a list of the What's up?
Have you ever done, like, you try to go to sleep at night, and you really want to go to sleep, but you can't really stop thinking, and things come to you, and continue to come to you, and you really can't quiet your mind? Has that ever happened to you?
Never.
Never? My question is...
Of course I have, yeah.
My question is, how does something become invisible? Especially something that for the last year we've had an engagement with people. How do indigenous people become invisible? How will we go about that process?
Why do you think that's something that we need to engage with or explain?
Am I wrong about that?
I don't know if you're wrong about this. I'm trying to figure out. Right. Our argument is not how do you become invisible. Our argument is that we should uphold invisibility.
What's that mean?
Our argument, can I help answer this?
Sure.
Our argument is that your claim, which we should produce new visions of understanding, we should try and understand the visions of Native Americans, is essentially a seek and destroy tactic. While you may not intend it that way, we, as the agents of colonialism and as implicated in it, our intellectual resources to be exploited for
Mum's the word.
destruction.
Yeah?
Throw up our hands?
Throw up our hands. Mum's the word.
Exactly? No.
No? What's the alternative then?
Our alternative isn't silence in the Northwestern FG sense. Our alternative is that we, rather than seeking out, rather than attempting to understand Native American visions, should do precisely the opposite, because the more people that know who are members of the imperial culture, the more attempts there are to mine us for potential use, our resources
What
against
is
Native
the role of an
Americans.
affirmative debate round?
What is the goal of an affirmative debate round?
The role.
It doesn't particularly matter. You've chosen a role, and we've said that your role is incorrect. I'm not a debate theorist. I hate that stuff. I hate pigs and disco. I just want to debate.
One of your link arguments is that we affirm the vision of federal control.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, you said
Is
that.
it just that we say the words federal control?
No,
I mean,
no,
because
it's-
our 1AC is pretty
remember-
explicit about the way
Okay.
that those words unravel
Right.
themselves.
Okay, the words unravel themselves. Exactly. We use that language in our 1MC link explanation. Our argument is that the words can unravel themselves, but in the end, the judges still have to evaluate whether or not affirming those words as presently constructed in the resolution
Why
is a
does
good
when the judge
idea.
decide they affirm that as presently constructed when the 1AC calls into question those constructions?
Okay, that's fantastic. And our argument throughout this debate is going to be that your 1AC is a beautiful work of prose that ends with a concept of a vision of affirming a resolution that you spent the rest of your 1AC refuting. Our argument will be that endorsing a vision of the United States federal government should substantially increase federal control throughout Indian country is not a way to exercise transversal dissent, and if it is not net beneficial, that instead we should say no to federal control. It is a more effective mode of demonstrating our resistance to that type of federal control, and that your affirmative essentially ends in a statement which it refutes itself.
We shouldn't take a chance in hoping that the system collapses on itself.
The Deloria evidence, the 1AC talks about how there's a hegemony within the West that assumes it basically knows the world. It takes certain assumptions for granted. These are assumptions about time, space, reason, ontology, agency, subjectivity, causality, knowledge, and a whole host of other assumptions. These fundamental orientation towards the world is one that enacts domination with style of thinking that denies the infinite multitudes of different ways of being in the world. It's epicidal. This Walter Bigelow in 2000, a consequent description of other thinking is a way of thinking is not intended to dominate, humiliate, a way of thinking is universally marginal, fragmentary, and unachieved, and as such, it's not epicidal. Science societies in which talking, writing take place, but not heard, and the planetary production of science societies, even they speak, are not listened to in their difference. The Deloria evidence talks about how challenging this framework means a rearrangement of our manner of perceiving the world. We think that that's a valuable enterprise within the debate forum. We don't seek the rejection of ideas, neither does the Deloria evidence. Is talking about how we need to open it up to allow for other ways of being in the world, as their own Deloria evidence says in the part that they don't read. This uncertainty is liberating in a much more fundamental way than any other development in the history of Western civilization. It means that religious, political, economic, and historical analysis of human activities that have been derived from the Western tradition do not have an absolute claim on us. We are free to seek a new synthesis that draws information from every culture and every period of human history and has boundaries only as a requirement that it makes more sense and more data than any other synthesis. Even the initial premise of such a synthesis can be different from what we have previously used to begin our formulation of that picture of reality. Our argument is that we can draw from each of all these different cultures and ways in which they can be positive and productive in our everyday lives. That Deloria evidence is really specific about how it can be a synthesis. It doesn't require an absolute rejection of the Western system of rationality or anything like that. Rather, it's a way in which we can be in the world inclusively. Our argument is the ways in which we approach the world of the West is dominating right now, and that needs to be ruptured. This domination occurs in our approach to the world, but it specifically extends to academic debates, such as our approach to language. The language we use assumes a very specific lingo. The idea that our approach, for instance, the approach to the flow, the demand for a judicial affirmation of the resolution, the assumption that like the vowel represents what went down the debate. We make assumptions about literality, that words correspond to essential hidden ideas, that syntax flows from left to right across the page, that each word has its own distinct meaning, and that meaning is something that has an inevitable effect on us, that the subject sense is separate from the object sense. There's so many assumptions to go into our approach to language. However, this is a very narrow way of viewing language. We have to break open these linguistic structures to allow for other possibilities for liberation. White 2000. How can one turn language from a method of domination to an instrument of resistance? Challenges the practice of domination and intends to open up vacant space, must engage in a struggle with conventionally recognized linguistic practices. Dissent cannot be separated from critique of language, for it remains ineffective as long as it does not interfere with the ways in which linguistic systems of exclusion constitute and objectivize social practices. The Deloria and Bigelow evidence go further to talk about how this notion of how language operates in a singular way only causes that style of domination, which we assume, for instance, the idea moves from one idea to the next idea to the next idea. They say that we've linked back into our affirmative by you speaking in the English language or something. However, our affirmation of the resolution as a vision is an attempt to deny that literality. That means that which just straight turns to their arguments about how we just need to walk away from the resolution because it makes an assumption about the reading of the resolution that is distinctly Western. Our argument is that it's productive in the ways in which we can deny those things. Also, our argument is about how there's multiple different meanings to all the words of the resolution. We give the example how, for instance, the Indian country means more than just the continental United States, and it means it means the soldiers, the American soldiers in Vietnam spoke about Vietnam as Indian country. The federal control means more than just power over. It can mean restraint of. It can mean as well as control over the states, or however, in many different ways people interpreted control for their affirmations of the resolution. Our argument is it's necessary to break open these concepts to allow for liberation from those imposed meanings, that the way to step away from the hegemonic view of control and power is within that as a form of resistance. Flicker 2000. The daring task to open up the concepts is not fit into the concepts to resist destroying power and return the conceptual to the non-conceptual. The first step towards a disassociating concept is simply to refuse to define it monologically. One cannot eliminate the contradictory, the fragmentary, and the discontinuous. Contradictions are only contradictions. One assumes the existence of a prior universal standard of reference. Besides, specifically, our argument is that within the debate forum that can be productive because it allows us to challenge our notions of pluralism. That when we approach the topic with a specific intent, i.e., that we already know what those words mean in the topic, that allows for us to deny the specific topic areas that we're talking about. Or what we can do is in our interpretation instead allow the peoples and the arguments and the knowledge base that we're talking about to infect the way in which we interpret that topic. This allows for that transdisciplinarity that the Bleicher Evans they read talks about. In fact, I usually read one of the cards that they read in the 2NC in my 2AC about the interdisciplinarity, the need to step back and forth between different bodies of literature. These different bodies of literature are the ideas of, for instance, the international relations literature the Bleicher's engaged in, as well as the indigenous literature that the Delora Evans is engaged in, as well as academic debate in the sense that we engage in a discipline right here, and we're debating about that discipline. And the failure to do that, to do so only means that we participate in the very concealing of different avenues of resistance that they would have you do, because they say to walk away from this resolution, to not affirm it. In essence, what they're doing is only guaranteeing the hegemony of that interpretation of the resolution. Embracing transversality is critical to busting out of these disciplinary boundaries. We affirm the resolution as transversal because the world does not conform itself to those disciplines. The boundaries are constantly in flux, and easy identification and classification is no longer possible. That is the failure to break down these boundaries engages in ethicide, as the Mendel Evans talks about. And for that reason, we also affirm the resolution and its everydayness. Traditional theories of dissent are defunct because they rely on singular notions of action, i.e. great events. That they talked about how you just need to say no to the resolution as if that could cause some sort of great event of causality, and then we've escaped the federal control of this debate topic. This debate topic insists, whether or not you like it, our arguments we have to come to grips with that in our everyday lives. In that everydayness, we should affirm the resolution as a vision which allows us to counter those dominant ways of viewing the world. In other words, the approach it is a way in which those things come to us in multitudes of different ways, rather than just that singular, rational, logical notion of the resolution. The failure to come to grips with those different forms of action and agency only enacts domination because we assume that we already have the answers before we even ask the questions. Flicker in 2000. Grand theories uphold a specific image of dissent, but foreclose alternatives, and thereby runs the risk of entrenching some forms of domination. Popular dissent, unable to deal with subtle forms of domination. To acknowledge this is to take one more step and shift away from grand theories towards an articulation of human agency is not grounded in stable foundation, revolves around the discursive understanding of power relations. The Delora evidence and the Delora evidence goes further and talks about how domination is located in our orientation towards the world. This may seem abstract, however, the ways of thinking that we engage in directly infect the policies that are enacted. Resistance requires a slow transformation of values in everyday practice. Said that it's not these heroic practices that you can somehow just reject something, rather occurs in these everyday practices of Bleicher 2000. Once one conceptualizes global politics, a series of overlapping transversal struggles, various new forms of dissent come into view. Human agency takes place in a variety of other, often mundane or unrecognized domains. Dissent is no longer solely associated with mass uprising. Transversal dissent located in countless non-heroic practices make up the realm of everyday life and its multiple connections with global life. The Bleicher evidence that they read against us doesn't assume our affirmative, because we're not claiming that Bleicher is an absolute solvency. Their argument, even attacking great events, is the very argument that we're making. Of course, that this style of resistance is not immune to co-optation. However, the only way we can have that resistance is through this slow transformation of cultural values, because the Bleicher evidence talks about how Bleicher's talking about how we can't make assumptions about causality or static notions of agency, because to do that is to enact domination. That means within this form, the way in which dissent occurs is necessarily without those linear notions of causality. Also, is the fact that we don't anchor ourselves in these particular views. We don't claim that there's an absolute truth. In fact, our Delora evidence is kind of specific about how it's just a dominating way of viewing the world that necessarily negates it. We have to look for a new synthesis between multiple different cultures. Their last Bleicher card only proves why to vote affirmative, because we are not that grand theory. The Lawson evidence they talk read only turns their attempt to step outside of the system, because it says we need to engage in practical forms of dissent, and it doesn't apply to us because we are attempting that type of practical dissent within this type of form in which we can engage in those things, we believe that we are the middle ground between the Lawson evidence and the Leiker evidence, because Lawson is criticizing Leiker's notion of Leiker's attempt to negate agency. Rather, I think it's a misreading of Leiker. However, we provide a way in which we can have agency within that world which accommodates the Lawson evidence and the Leiker turns, what they call them. The Spino's argument is only offense out for us because they need to question the ontological grounding and embrace the spectral difference. This does not mean that we should not have politics in this context in a way in which we can agree that the 1AC only links to the 1AC criticizes those very notions of how we need to oppose the world. Look, we're not saying that all rationality is bad. We're not saying that like problem solution, as they talk about it, they say the double intrinsic case. That's not our claim. Rather, it's opening up to different ways of being the world that's valuable. I think that Deloria evidence is on point to that. The idea that we need a new synthesis among many different cultures.
Let's talk about what your vision is of voting negative, okay? You seem to me to describe in the 2AC that you think that voting negative is telling us to walk away from the resolution with our current understanding of what the resolution means. Is that right?
Well, you say federal control is always bad, so always say no to the resolution.
Okay, so let's say, what do you think our interpretation, what do you think the people in this crowd and the 9 judges here, what do you think their interpretation of the resolution is now? What is their understanding of federal control? Do they think it's good or bad?
In a universal sense, or like for the context of this debate round?
I don't know, you seem to say that there's some kind of static notion of what we think of it right now.
In the context of this debate round, our affirmation is not of that traditional notion of control. It's of that vision of the resolution, which does not mean literal. You can't separate out those words and say federal government here, federal control here, Indian country over here.
The separation argument doesn't apply to us. We're saying that
it does,
your
because
vision
your definition relies on that.
Our argument is that your vision of endorsing the words the U.S. federal government should substantially increase federal control. We're saying that you should walk away from that because everyone in this room will walk away from that if you vote negative and walk away from that and think that federal control is bad. If you can, how can you win this as an offensive argument unless you can prove that we should have any other understanding of federal control than federal control is bad?
I mean, our Deloria evidence that talks about how when you think you know the nature of reality such that you can say control objectively bad, that engages in domination.
This is not the truth. This is not what we're saying. Jason, we're not saying that this is the objective truth. Okay? I recognize personally, Callum recognizes personally, federal control may be good, federal control may be bad. But the question is, what does our community and what do these 9 judges walk away from this debate with?
I think
is
it
an understanding?
Reorientation of our manner of perceiving the world.
Okay, if we win, that regardless of whether or not it's true, that it's net beneficial or better strategically for us to walk away from this debate thinking that federal control is bad, what is the reason why you should vote affirmative? Does your evidence provide an offensive warrant in a world where we say that federal control is bad, even if it's not the objective truth?
Yes, because it's the idea that before we make that statement, we need to, first of all, allow silent societies into our planetary production of knowledge. We need to reorient our way of perceiving the world. That before we make that statement, before we say, I'm going to leave this room and say federal control bad, that you better damn well take different perspectives into mind and reorient that. I mean, the Deloria evidence is
denial of federal control. What if the denial of federal control, the reduction or elimination of federal control, is a precondition to our integration of that type of knowledge, to our understanding of the transversal nature of resistance, of any of that stuff? Why if we prove that getting rid of federal control is
I don't know where it happened in a case where you could prove that, because I disagree with that premise.
One thing that we have heard all year is that Native Americans are the targets of genocide. I want this to really sink in. Here's an extended version of a card that North Texas reads in their 1AC. It's from Freeburg in 2000. Taking the American people to task in the matter of genocide against indigenous populations creates a terrible taboo. Registered in the don't you dare category of academic do's and don'ts. This act of transgression is not derived from backing, but rather emanates from specific social contexts or lack thereof. While Hitler's policy of liberating from politics has been vilified and condemned to national metaphysics of Indian hating with such a formation of national identity, political policy in the United States. White man's burden of winning the West was a crushing global folly. The West was quite literally nowhere or everywhere for North American travel policies of like the West was not a dark and bloody ground to be won for Anglo-Americans. It was exactly that. Its consequence, the West was at the bottom of performance society, even on our round earth. Winning the West amounted to no less than winning the world. For 4 centuries after Columbus, the ideology of the vast races firmly established itself in American soil. The ideology of manifest destiny transferred from one generation to another, so there's no need for the kind of propaganda machine required to make willing executions of ordinary men and women, Americans, and their driving forward. One nation fought with God on their side. Eurocentric is a racial conception of the indigenous peoples reflecting scholarly writings is now so complete. The second nation, and most Americans, is passed under popular and common knowledge that no intent to distort the truth is any longer necessary. All that is required is the recitation of a rote learning and passive uncritical generation. generation from the next. There's a thick kind of hatred born of the guilt and privilege of living with 3 generations of complicity each day. We who hold the position of privilege must come face to face with those who we have dispossessed, the others who rightfully share the complicity, and the old Indians are far away and long ago. For most of these people, reflection consists of allowing wisdom to approach and seeking answers to self-generated questions as an attitude stands in polarized opposition to the manner in which society today conducts itself. There are a couple of things that we shouldn't forget about on this topic. Look, we have learned a few things from debating this topic all year. One of them is that we are amidst an act of genocide. This vision of the topic cannot be redeployed. Even Fort Hayes has changed over time. They used to read almost no evidence. Now their 2&C reads a dozen cards. They still don't have a plan, but it's getting closer and closer as they advocate things like redeployment of a vision. They aren't bad people, of course. None of us are bad people, probably, but we are fixated on federal control. It's the locus of what we understand. It's the locus of our vision. It's what we have to constantly come to grips with. Even if the words can change meaning, even if the whole resolution be understood as a single united vision, it's wholly irrelevant because the concept of it spreads beyond. There's an argument which is responded to in the 2AC, which I believe is probably true, which is that even if their transversal descent has ripple effects beyond our community, even if it spreads to other people, they will not always be there to interpret the effects of this, which means that resolution of the topic, if you vote affirmative, people don't know what happens. The thing that spreads is a genocidal ideology. We are essentially the keepers of concentration camps, an argument which they concede. Our evidence about Dylan Meyer describes the way that he was chosen to head the BIA because he had formerly led the Japanese relocation program. In other words, he had experience in controlling and destroying people. Even though Dylan Meyer honestly wanted to help, his knowledge was redeployed in a way that was violent and destructive, and they have conceded an argument that in the modern age there is nothing that we know, there is no resource that is safe, nothing inside my brain cannot be extracted by the right agent for the right price, for the right amount of electricity, for the right amount of exposure to heat or cold or anything else. We are essentially like concentration camp guards standing around. We are dissenting from the system. We want the people that we were supposed to watch over to escape. Their way of doing so is to understand the maps that Native Americans have, to see where they run to get out of the reservation/concentration camp. They want to understand their perspective. They want the silence to be included in their world. They want to see what is going on inside their heads. Our alternative instead is to close our eyes and throw open the gates to allow them to escape without knowing where they're going, which means that no manner of extraction, no amount of interrogation can turn up the answer to where they are. Our argument is consistent with 99% of what the affirmative advocates, their vision of the world of knowledge, their rejection of Western knowledge, etc. Our only question is how and what and why do we do these things. There's essentially no impact in their argument, to use traditional debate speak, and there's no implication to these arguments, which captures our argument about genocide, an argument made in the 1&C. We can't open up control completely. They've conceded our arguments. We're agents of genocide. They agree. Other
side.
Wrong direction.